people don't think of themselves as a caregiver. They say, I'm a daughter, I'm taking care of my mother, or I'm a husband and I'm taking care of my wife because she's my wife. And so I'm not necessarily considering myself a caregiver. So that's it's a big, it's a heavy lift. And that's why organizations and programs and outreach like what you're doing is important.
That was Dr. Eboni Green, and we are talking about caregivers today. Welcome to the Recover Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Martin John, and I'm interested in talking about the many topics that you'll face while on a journey to recovering yourself. This podcast is all about expanding the definition and scope of how we understand both addiction and recovery, to open the conversation to allow everyone the opportunity to recover themselves. This way, no matter where you are on that journey, there is a place for you here. There's a whole world of caregivers out there. You are probably a caregiver of some sort. You know, since the pandemic hit, we've all been emotionally taxed, and none more so than the caregivers in our lives. And today, we want to broaden your definition of caregiver to include parents, those who care for elderly parents, teachers, and even people who play supporting roles in both our lives and communities. In one way or another, we are all caregivers, even if we're only caring for ourselves. And the role of being a caregiver, even if that is only for yourself, is more important than you may initially think. When it comes down to it, if you are caring for yourself, you are benefiting your community by being healthy and strong. That, in turn, makes you available to help those who are not capable of that. When you are caring for yourself, you're not going to tax your community or relationships, and that is a big deal, especially because we are just getting our heads above water with this pandemic. This episode is all about resilience fatigue, and although it is great to help yourself and be a support for others, those of us who do that may find ourselves identifying with that way too much. Everyone around us may have identified us as a pillar of strength, and we may have, some of us maybe more reluctantly, embrace that identity. Because of that, we may not feel free to ask for the time off, the help, or the space to care for our own mental health. There needs to be a recognition of the value caregivers add to our communities, and we all have to acknowledge that caregiving is more than just a job, and most caregivers, like parents, never get financially compensated for their societal contributions. But that doesn't mean they aren't rendering a value or being taxed. Dr. Green, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm excited to chat with you.
When we started talking, we talked a lot about the resilience fatigue. And I'm really intrigued by this because those of us who are resilient have been taxed over the last year. And those of us in the caregiver roles are the ones, like, where the rubber meets the road on policy and so many things. Can you talk to me about what you've been seeing in terms of resilience fatigue, especially as it relates to the last year and a half we've been having?
Absolutely. I want to preface the conversation with, often my focus is wellness among family and frontline caregivers. And as a part of that, we have a U model, which is empowering you to care for yourself. And part of that model is resilience. So part of the reason that I've even started thinking about resilience fatigue is because we're always encouraging caregivers to look at situations, and when they're challenged by those situations, to use their strength and the things that they know are working for them to reapproach situations, especially as they relate to caregiving. And so I've started thinking about resilience. I mean, I've thought about resilience for a long time, but I've started thinking about it in the context of, we have been through so much this past year and a half. And so if I'm experiencing some level of fatigue related to looking at new approaches to caring, to advocacy, to the things that I'm doing in my daily life, what is this looking like for folks who are caregivers and who are in that sphere of having to reapproach things? And it's not just, for some of us, it's the big things, but for caregivers, it could be the little things, like having to talk to a parent or loved one about the fact that they're not going to be able to go to the senior center to see their friends, and so how do we reapproach those types of situations? And so I really do feel like it's ingrained in many caregivers that we are resilient, that we look at different approaches after we, calibrate. We look at different approaches to things, but having to do it day in and day out on a large scale is something new.
Now, this becomes a liability not only for the individual, but because we have relied on the engine of caregivers, and we are continuing to rely on the engine of caregivers as we have an increasing elderly population entering into different situations in which caregivers are at the center of that. How is this a liability nationally and like globally?
I think that the challenge is that it's not an inherent thing for everyone to do everything regarding providing care for an elder or a child with special needs. I think when you have a child with special needs, you kind of have an opportunity to grow into that. But with parents, we're talking about someone who is a full adult, and not everybody knows or has an inclination to providing care for someone who is an elder or a senior, and that makes it really challenging from a national perspective and from a global perspective, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's like you bring up this interesting point. Like, and I always look at it like, okay, when you have a child, you are both learning together.
Mm-hmm.
When you adopt an adult, right, an elderly person, like they have their entire life, and you've probably only lived half of that. Like, how you can offer care to this person and how you can really like you really need this ability to be resilient and learn quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And caregivers have this quality that is trained into them and is naturally that they are naturally geared toward in order to do that. But now, what about in the caregiver field? Like, I mean, we've found and we've all seen caregivers that, well, maybe they should not be caregivers. How when it comes to this sort of level of resilience or this sort of level of fatigue that we're experiencing, what happens under those circumstances, and what do we need to be like vigilant about, not only as caregivers but as peers, and how can we kind of be good peers?
That's an excellent question. I think that understanding that caregivers, professional and family, we're not homogeneous. We have folks who are going to be better at certain aspects of care. And so understanding that some folks are going to feel more comfortable than others with performing certain tasks. And so, for example, my background is in nursing. And so I started my career with providing personal care as a nursing assistant. And I'm very comfortable with those things. If I need to give someone, an elder or a family member, a bed bath, or, help them with their medications, things like that, I'm in my element. It's not going to be uncomfortable for me. Whereas with my husband, and we care for his grandmother, those wouldn't be his strengths.
It's
And I
very,
think
very,
we're
very diplomatic of you to use that.
so I think sometimes what happens is that if you are in a situation where you don't have the ability to look at what an individual's strengths are in the caregiving role and lean on those, and we expect that the one caregiver is going to do everything, is going to fill every role, we increase the risk for burnout and we decrease the opportunity for resilience because individuals are just uncomfortable, frustrated, overwhelmed, and the whole nine.
Yeah. And then we're also increasing risk to the patient,
Mm-hmm.
and trauma as well, because it's not intentional. Just like many of our parents, those of us who have experienced like small t trauma, they didn't intentionally make us kind of like experience this. They don't know any better, and then they move into this role, and instead of maybe learning together with a child, they assumed a lot of things as they went into their role as caregiver of a child. And I do like the fact that we are talking about the broader,
Mm-hmm.
perspective of caregiving here, because we're all, like I mentioned earlier, we're all caregivers, and we're all at risk to burnout. And, giving can turn pretty quickly into a way to pacify how we feel.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to think about ourselves when we're caring about other people. And so caregivers, and, like, I mean, I'm like in my audience, a lot of us are, like had addiction or overuse disorders and other things like that. And so, caregiving is and can act as a pacifier for many of us. And when it does, and something like this comes up, like the pandemic, what happens is there's no, we can't give, and we have to change our pacifier. Like, we have to
Yeah.
change how we are interacting even with ourselves, because our jobs can often become just a way to forget that I'm important, right? Like, to forget that I have needs, because now I have to do my job. But the pacifier really, or the pandemic really brought that to light. And
Mm-hmm.
we are experiencing quite a bit. And let's talk about being a self-caregiver. Right? Being a caregiver of self, because okay, if you don't care for somebody else, unless you're a teenager or a child, you do have to care for yourself if you don't care for somebody else. So what can be learned from, what is here as a self-caregiver? What do we need to do so we can, one, take some load off of those who are caregivers and give ourselves some of that responsibility?
Shifting focus to ourselves, I think, can, for some of us, can feel selfish. And it's really not. It's really all about being able to do things. And even if you're talking about being a caregiver, being able to do that long term. It's sometimes self reflection, I think, is the most challenging aspect of making sure that you are doing the things like setting time aside for meditation, journaling, or are you getting enough sleep? Those types of things. One of the things I've had the pleasure of creating is a tool called the Emma tool, and it is on the Caregiver Support Services site. It is free. And the reason it is there is because I find this to be the most challenging aspect of empowering caregivers, is to help them to find ways to improve what they're doing or find more time to do things for themselves. And so the Emma tool, you answer questions. It's based on the wellness model. And so then Emma will, once you submit, Emma will come on the screen and she'll say, hey, you're doing really well here with regard to your well being. But here's something, one thing that you might look at. Maybe it's your physical health, maybe it's your spiritual health, or well being, and give you suggestions and links to things that help you as the caregiver. Because I find that to be, you can't say take care enough to caregivers
Mm-hmm.
because we often don't prioritize our own needs.
Right. Yeah. One of my biggest focuses is supporting caregivers in the role of, and primarily in the role of addiction and counselors and stuff. So many trainings and other things are about, like, hey, here's another thing that you can put. Here's another log for your fire. Here's another log for your fire. The thing is our caregivers aren't keeping warm at that fire. Like, that is
Right.
a fire for their clients. The work that around Recover Yourself and the trainings that I do, and I believe the work that you're doing, is all about like we have to support our caregivers. Our caregivers are carrying the load when it comes to those of us that are having difficulty, and we really need to respect that position and get and I would love to see caregivers have a stronger voice in the government as well as in the marketplace. Like the marketplace can create all of this, like we look at social media and we have anxiety issues. Well, those things are connected, and caregivers are having to pick up the pieces for this. Can you speak a little bit about the tumbling, the dominoes that come down and actually fall in the laps of caregivers?
Well, I think as you mentioned, from the broadest scale is the financial. We often look at financial impacts of things. And so the financial impact that if we didn't have caregivers, what that would look like, then, the advocacy component of the mantra of take care, but then also not always giving caregivers actionable things that they can actually do and making it okay that they do them. It's like, if you have a work wellness program and we suggest that you do XYZ, are you going to be given the opportunity to do that? Because if you're working as a nurse or an addictions counselor or what, how many times are you eating lunch while you're charting or while you're responding to an email? So are you even getting the what would be considered our standard break times, self-care times that are built into your day? And now pull in the pandemic, and how many more hours are we working because work is with us in our computer um, every day. So you think, okay, I'm lightening my load here and I'm going to have more time for these self care things. And what ends up happening is that we continue to fill in that space. And I don't know if that's just the type A personalities being drawn to the caregiving situation, or if you are a caregiver and then you become a type A where you're thinking all the time and considering all the time. There are organizations that are, like you said, like ours and others, that are trying to continue bringing the voice of caregivers to government, to cities, to workplace. But it's something that, because we are often those hidden folks, we're behind the scenes folks, unless you really take an effort to bring it out, it often just, people don't think of themselves as a caregiver. They say, I'm a daughter, I'm taking care of my mother, or I'm a husband and I'm taking care of my wife because she's my wife. And so I'm not necessarily considering myself a caregiver. So that's a, it's a big, it's a heavy lift. And that's why organizations and programs and outreach like what you're doing is important.
Yeah, and we also have to make sure that there's so many people that can may not be a caregiver and then have to deal with someone after they die. And that's a caregiving role. Even
Mm-hmm.
though they've passed, there are tasks that have to be done. There are things that you have to, and that's the role of a caregiver. And we have to be able to pick this bucket up as a community. And that's something that, like you said, it gets overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
Like the work of a caregiver gets overlooked for the work of those who are putting people in need of caregivers. And
Yeah.
and without that, without like we all support and love social media, but if it's creating anxiety at the level that we know it's being created, and we need caregivers in order to help people detox from overuse of digital media, why aren't we equally talking about the caregivers here?
I think too that when we're thinking about resiliency, that there is a place for conversation about grief and how it's not always the tangible grief things that you would think about, like the loss of a person that you love,
Mm-hmm.
um, but the whole shift in the way that we're living right now. And I don't know if this happens to you, but sometimes I'm either scrolling on, of social media, or I'm looking at an old, generally it's like when I'm scrolling on something on social media, and
Doom
you kind
scroll.
of have you have you have that like little bit of a panic because you see people in pictures without masks, but
Mm,
it's their older pictures, or
yeah.
you're watching people in, so that anxiety that you have because of the pandemic, that's a whole level, another level of the grief of the loss of the way things were. So when I think about this topic, I think it's packed with a lot of things that we're not considering, and so it makes me worry about many of the things that you've mentioned today, about the place for public policy and how we acknowledge caregivers, and how we make sure that we're integrating supports for caregivers into our systems, and how we need to make sure that we as caregivers on a professional level, that we're taking the time to do the things we need to do for ourselves, because we don't really know what the other side of this is going to look like. And I do believe there are going to be a lot of, and we may be seeing some statistics about it now, but a lot of folks who are not only tired of trying to figure out the puzzle each day, but who are also grieving the losses of the way that things were, because it's going to be different now.
Some people are not equipped to change.
Mm-hmm.
One of the wonderful things about the recovery community is that we understand change really, really well, and that was a big reason why, again, I want to make sure that we're having this conversation. And when right now, we are facing so much change, and we have to support the caregivers, and hopefully the numbers start coming in and we can see how much we need caregivers, and how much caregivers, not only nurses, because of course the nurses and doctors all helped throughout this pandemic in a way that is unmeasurable, but the caregivers who are also dealing with the opioid epidemic
Mm-hmm.
during the same time, the caregivers who are dealing with the elderly, the caregivers who work at the locations that people utilize, the YMCA's, which were closed down but are now opening back up, and the park districts, the community has caregivers as well. And those caregivers have to be recognized for, creating programming and being able to like run program, because a caregiver also is a coach, like a
Right.
sports coach, other things like that. And they've experienced this as well and have had to, my guess is, show up to their community in a different capacity. And yet maybe they aren't equipped to do that because we separate them from the idea of what a caregiver is.
It's very complex to think about all of the folks who are our make up our social structure, and who really support folks throughout their lifespan in caregiving capacities. You also think about, or I'm from what you were just saying, I'm also thinking about what does that look like if you're an opioid addiction counselor, and because people are so much more distressed, what's your caseload looking like? We already know there are not enough folks in the field. So are there people who are now recognizing and acknowledging, because they've hit a brick wall, that they need this type of support, that they need this type of counseling or service. And what does that look like for individuals who are taking on new clients? And then because we know that usually it's a crisis situation, then we're in that position where we're probably not going to say no,
Mm.
even though our caseload is going up, going up, going up, because we want to help people. But what are we doing to make sure we're nourished and have the capacity to continue giving? Like you said, we're just giving, giving, giving. And a lot of us are that way, where we're just not going to probably say no. We'll figure out every other thing, but to say you're not going to be able to do something. And so then what are you giving up in your life in order to take on that extra client or that additional task? And then, like we were saying, because you're tied to your computer, if you're doing virtual visits, how late in the day or early in the morning are you? And then the other thing is, do our minds shut off? Like,
Mm.
if you have a client that you're concerned about, and or a loved one that you're concerned about, that doesn't necessarily go away just because I'm not sitting next to you or I'm not on the computer um, having a visit with you. So it's one of those things where it's a lot to unpack. And as you mentioned, that's why I think this is such an important
Yeah.
conversation.
And we want, as caregivers, we want, like, our work and what we're passionate about is giving
Hmm.
and giving care, right? Like that was the easy way to say it. But we have to learn as a society where to draw these lines, not only as individuals, but we also have to learn how to draw the line of, like, hey, one, we need to be able to say no, and we will more easily be able to do that if we love and care for ourselves
Hmm.
wholly. And we won't have to do it because, like, when I say we need to say no, the first thought many people can have is like, oh, you're not giving care, you're not helping somebody. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily true. By saying no, we can just be like, hey, can you take care of this? Or we can offer something. And our minds, when they are not stressed, will find the answer much quicker than when we're like, I can't say no. Because when I say I can't say no, that puts my back up against the wall, and now it's fight or flight stress time. And that's just not going to help anybody.
It's not. And when you were talking earlier about what kind of circumstances do we see where there's an increase in the care not being effective, and it's not always that it's directly related to the caregiver being distressed, so then they're abusive. That's not necessarily, especially in like a family situation. It's
Mm-hmm.
usually things like the past relationship. You know, I find that for a lot of folks that it's really hard if you have, like you said, a lot of us, our parents were learning, and as parents, we're learning as our children are growing. But to have someone who was maybe not present or who was abusive, and now you're in the role of caregiver and you don't have other options,
Right.
that's where we see there being a really unhealthy balance, because you're now having to do things for someone that didn't do those things for you.
Right.
And so when you're saying the practice of saying no but giving other options, that can be great. Getting other people involved, that can be helpful. Knowing what your limits are and not feeling guilty for not wanting to necessarily go all in a relationship that is already a damaged relationship.
Yeah.
So if there hasn't been healing, and even if there has been healing and forgiveness, you don't forget. And so, you know, you may have situations where again, where you're ending up being the primary person meeting all the needs of someone who didn't do the same for you. And that is difficult. And it is, I feel like it's extremely difficult now while we're in the pandemic, and there may just not be other options.
Right.
So you can't necessarily get the help that you need. Um,
And
that's challenging.
getting triggered is so easily it so easily happens when you are around family.
Hmm.
And that trigger that you're experiencing can very easily, um, if you aren't working on yourself, if you aren't trying to remain calm, in light of this, it wouldn't take long. A couple weeks, like if you're caregiving for somebody every day, it could take a couple days. Um, but once you're triggered, every time you visit or every time you have to deal with something, that trigger can come up again. And so it's real important that we take care of ourselves, take care of our triggers, so that, because if you're doing this and there are no other options, you may feel like your backs up against the wall, but we have to, as people, as family, as everything, we have to be able to, with our best intent, approach the situation, as our best, from the best position that we can. And triggered is not a good position to step it into.
Yeah, I just think that that is, if folks get nothing else out of our conversation, I think that is one of the most important things to think about with regard to protecting yourself, and being proactive at understanding when folks are triggering, because then what happens is the person triggers you, and then something's wrong with you, and then we don't have to focus on fixing what the real issue is, because everybody's focused on the triggering thing.
Right.
And I'm what I mean by that is specifically, like, if you have someone, you're saying, okay, I need you to do XYZ, and then they don't want to do that, or they don't want to take their meds, or they don't want to allow the home health person to come in because they want you to do it. And then you're so distressed. Now we're talking about something else, but we're not talking about the fact that the bottom line is, I'm not going to be able to do this part.
Right.
So we need someone else to do that part so I can be healthy, and then not feeling guilty about it.
Yeah. I like looking at it like it's a complex system, because one, they don't take their meds, and then you feel upset, you argue, and then give in, and then 6 weeks later they don't finish their cereal for breakfast and you blow it, right?
Right.
Like that's it. Why? Because 6 weeks ago, and we might not even connect those things. And
Mm-hmm.
that is what caregivers have to be able to recognize and let go of. Your comment earlier when you said you don't forget. Like, no, you might not remember or you might not connect like outwardly those things, but they're connected. And when they're connected, like that's happening subconsciously within inside of us. And we're all caregivers. And even if we're only caregivers of ourselves, that can come down to self-judgment and not caring for ourselves in other ways.
And who knows how, or who knows what is going to trigger you more than a parent,
Mm.
or a spouse, or a child,
Or a
even
sibling
if
that
it's
you've
a
been like,
sibling. Yeah, they know that, if I just stay on this point here and I just harp, or bring this thing up, then eventually you're going to blow up, or they're waiting for that. And then we can stop focusing on what the real issue is, and we can spend our time focusing on what you said or what you did, and then that becomes that vicious, cycle. And I tell you, some folks are parents, and folks are experts at just like poking to try to get that response. And it really, again, has nothing to do with the medication or the cereal, but it's the control part of things. And if I'm over here feeling all out of control because I know I didn't treat you well, and now you are here caring for me. And so the way that I can make this more uncomfortable for both of us is for me to be obstinate and not go by anything that you do, the things that are would be easy, do the easy thing,
Right.
so that we can both be angry.
Yeah.
And that is, it's a lot to unpack, but it's something that you see a lot. And then when you do finally blow, because that's probably not in your nature, then you feel so horrible about, oh, now I flipped out and I didn't really want to react that way. But the person that you're caring for, or the person in that situation, that's the reaction that they're looking for. So they're going to maybe stay on that until they get it.
One thing that, and we're talking about caregivers, but we have to talk about care receivers as well.
Mm-hmm.
Care receivers, especially now, we talk, I talk a lot about like addiction and other things like that. Care receivers, people who are receiving love from others when they're in the midst of their addiction, will often do things to make the lives of those who are caregiving hell.
Yeah.
um, but we have to put, we ask like, hey, society, put your caregiver hat on and think about the role of the caregiver a bit. And I also want caregivers to be able to put their care receiver hat on and be able to think about like the role of the care receiver. Like if you have a parent that you're caring for and they're holding a lot of shame around how they raised you because now you are caring for them, they're not going to admit that.
Right.
They in order for them, they may admit that, they may look at themselves, but that is not the primary concern at the moment. Their primary concern is to how to save face. And
Mm-hmm.
in order to do that, they may double down on making them feel better by making you feel worse.
Right. And I think that, again, because we're in this pandemic and you may not have access to some of the resources or the things that you could get out and do to have the ability to, decompress, then here we are again with this rubber band that we stretched and stretched and stretched and stretched. And it's stretch, stretch, stretch. And now it's not going to come back together because we've stretched it out, trying to think of different approaches to so that we don't have to have the conflict in the caregiving. Because what we're really trying to do is just make sure your needs are met, and that
Mm-hmm.
that's done in a as loving and kind manner as possible. But if you have that control variable happening, the person that you are trying to support and care for sometimes just won't let you do that.
And that's difficult. And we all need to recognize that. We need to recognize that it's difficult to receive. I heard somebody say recently, like, receiving should be an Olympic sport because
Mm-hmm.
it is not easy. And giving care is not easy either. Giving
No.
care is something that takes a lot of patience, but it takes a lot of you. So you are the thing that needs to constantly, you need to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
And once again, receiving, not easy, especially from yourself.
I think too, it's like, this is a simple example, but we're not elderly by any means. But my husband is at an age where I feel like we have two adult sons. He's a tremendous dad. He is working all the time. Let the boys cut the grass. But like you're saying, that something so simple, like let me cut the grass for you, Dad.
And dad being open to receiving that.
That's the point.
Like
Yeah.
there's two sides to all of this. One, you have to be cognizant enough to be like, hey, is it cool like that I do this? And then the other one being like, not playing the role of no, I got it, and really wanting some help. Like
Yeah.
there's a balance here we need to strike.
Yeah, and that's the thing, there's 50 million other things that he's doing. So then what will happen is, and I'm using the grass example for the same thing we were talking about with the medication or whatever other caregiving thing you're doing. So it'll be about the details of how the grass is cut. I mean, really.
And it's
So,
control, right? Like it's all
right.
and is that going to encourage anybody to come back and cut the grass again? No, it's not.
No,
And
right.
that's difficult, right? Because the grass is easy, but when your dad ends up living with one of them and then he gets difficult, and that's going to be something that has to be faced, and you can't just not show up anymore. You can't
Right.
just not cut the grass now when you got to change his diaper, right? Like, or whatever, depending on how, like what the situation is, like you got to put in a catheter sometimes, and like that's not pleasant.
Right.
And the shame or the embarrassment that could come with that is so deep that even though you're doing that for them, they're going to find it difficult to thank you for that.
Right. That's what makes it really hard to be resilient, because if it's you need to do the I'm doing this catheter, but dad hates it when I have to do this. And then you've got to put yourself through that whole mental um, put yourself in the right mental space to be able to do it. And then how you're going to even approach going in there to do it this time. So all the thinking you
But
do
he knows it's coming.
before, and he knows it's coming. So he's thought about how he's going to tell you how much he hates it. It's
Mm-hmm.
that whole thing. And then how do you recover and try a new approach the next time again and again and again, when we don't know how indefinitely this particular thing is going to be needed? It's really hard for caregivers to find those new approaches and things, um, and to recognize the um, that the negative part, or the I don't want you to do it, it's not about you. Like for my son, it's not about you, that anything that you would be doing with cutting the grass. It's about dad feeling like he doesn't want anybody doing anything that he doesn't compensate them
Right.
for, or that it's not a reciprocal thing. So he would rather
Transactional. Yeah.
do it himself than have somebody else. And so it has nothing to do with you,
Right.
but as a caregiver, as an adult child, as a spouse, it feels very personal.
Yeah.
And so then again, that can trigger all kinds of different responses. And then because it's your family member, they know what buttons to push so that you're both now uncomfortable.
Right. And I want to take that one step. I want to take that like to that 50,000 foot view and say, you know, as you don't want to bring it up, right? You got to change dad's catheter. I don't want to bring it up because it's a soft spot. Us as caregivers, we look at things like social media, we look at things like politics, and we don't want to bring it up. We don't want to bring it up because it's a soft spot, because
Mhm.
we can't put the numbers together right. Because what we're saying is we're like, you got to advocate for the addict because they have numbers that you can see. You got to advocate for the businesses because they have numbers you can see. But we're the ones that make that support both of those aspects. Like when you're stressed out at work, you come to us so you can continue working. When you're on the street, you come to us and then you can start buying again, because you're not buying illegally, you're not buying illegal drugs only, or you're not causing more cost. And we're this glue that is bringing everything together, and we don't want to mention it because it's a soft spot. And if we were to be able to have a broader conversation around this, I think we would all like the people that are benefiting from the caregivers out there who are afraid to tell their friends that they're getting help from caregivers. Like we would be in the forefront of the minds of the people who are who need to be able to talk about this and change and are able to change the policies around it.
Hmm. I find one of the most important things that I've been able to do, and I'm not giving myself any kind of a pat on the back about it, is, having grown up in a very, and I'll say religious, not spiritually nurturing, none of that, just, religious family, is that you often don't think about what you need to be doing for yourself, and you don't necessarily, if someone says that they have depression or something of that nature, or they have anxiety or what have you, you're supposed to pray. And God forbid you need a medication for, to help. So I'm a supporter of pray, but go see the therapist, pray and take the medication. And I also will say that I will let people know, hey, you think I have everything all together? I have a therapist. I talk to a counselor, and it's part of my self-care that I must have, because to get through some of the things that I've been through, or that I just like jam packed my schedule and did all these things so I didn't have to think about all the crazy, horrible stuff. And then you hit that brick wall,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not going to move forward. You're going to have to go check yourself in somewhere, something to that nature. That it's okay. That when you reach your capacity, hopefully that's not what has to prompt you to seek help.
Right.
That you just notice that, hey, this is a good thing for me to do for myself. Is to, I'm taking on all these things. I do all of these things, and hey, I deserve an opportunity to focus on me and to find ways to make sure that I'm not overdoing it for myself.
Because that ain't
And
helping anybody.
it's not. And you're going to burn out. It's not going to be pretty when it happens.
Mm-hmm.
It's not healthy. And and it's not sustainable.
And you're going to leave a wake of destruction. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there is no way around it. If you are not taking care of yourself, I don't care if you're, you know, an ex-addict who or a parent or a boss or a manager or a garbage man. I don't care what you do or who you are. If you're not caring for yourself, then you're gonna leave this wake of destruction. I'm not going to say you're going to hurt other people, although that's definitely possible. You are going to have to live down some bad choices.
Yeah. Every person has their, and I always relate it to spiritual gifts. And you'll sometimes I'll see things where, you have this person who is going, their job is to collect, garbage, but the way that they do it, and the people in the neighborhood know who they are, and you look forward to seeing that person. So it's all about how you are able to use the gifts that you have, and to acknowledge and know that they're a part of the bigger puzzle or picture, and that without you, it doesn't work the way that it should.
That's right. And if you're not healthy, you're going to go out there and, like, I mean, growing up in Chicago, male people and garbage people and like all of these people that like make the city run, like that was some important, those were important people to me as a child, because I looked at them and knew that they were the ones that took care of things. They were
Yeah,
caregivers.
they have a tangible service, and
Yeah.
you don't necessarily recognize that every day until they're not there to do it.
Right.
And that's what we're thinking about too with caregivers, that the if you're the person who's providing the hands-on care, of course, someone not being able to get out of bed today or to not be able to be clean in their bed or what have you, that's a direct, tangible thing that's felt and seen by that person. But you multiply that by all the people who are out there doing those types of things every day. A meal, how important a meal is, or having that person to talk to and bounce ideas off of, having the social worker there to help you with your paperwork. I mean, everybody plays their part in making sure that we support individuals in our vulnerable individuals in our society. And without them having the time or ability to focus on self-care, we do them and our communities a disservice.
Dr. Green, thank you so much for joining me. This was such a good conversation.
Yeah, I really have enjoyed talking to you about this whole thing.
Many of us in the caregiving roles are coming from a background rife with different kinds of abuse, physical, sexual, substance, all sorts of things. So many of us want to help others because we didn't receive help. This ties into next week's episode where I'm speaking with Judy Grizel about the opponent process theory. But here, for this episode, we have to be open enough to accept that even though we are caregivers, we may very well be overlooking ourselves. And if you're not a caregiver, I'm sure you know some, or are even being cared for by one or many. Caregivers come in all sorts of packages, and if over the past year you have leaned on someone and you can't think of one time they leaned on you, this is someone who is probably feeling the pinch, and a simple thank you can go a long way. I want to thank Dr. Green for spending time with me, and I hope all of you can see the complexity in this conversation and be sensitive to the fragility of resilience. It can, at one moment, be super strong and fortified, and at the next, it can collapse. And when that happens, it can affect way more than the one person experiencing that collapse. If you are a caregiver of any kind and have a story, resource, or questions, please leave those in the comments of this episode. We will attempt to respond to any questions we see, and if we do not, please DM me on Instagram and I will be sure to reach out. Giving back is at the core of many of our lives, so much so that even when we are on the verge of burnout, we can still go give more. You can find links to everything Dr. Green is doing in the description of this episode, including the Emma tool that she mentioned. Please rate and review this podcast and or leave comments for this episode to help me better create helpful content. Support this show at anchor.fm and support me through Patreon, where you will get access to unedited content as well as writings and access to supporter group portrait sessions with me. I host workshops regularly, which are both open to the public and are a source of continuing education units for professionals. I also take a limited number of one-on-one clients every month, so contact me when you're ready to work together through martinjohn.com. I also accept financial support through Venmo at martinjohn_Garcia, so if you benefit from listening to this, please consider supporting my efforts. Thank you for listening to the Recover Yourself podcast, and until next time, keep recovering yourself.